When it comes to ancient spirits and ghostly legends, the most famous myths often find their roots in Europe, Asia, Africa, or South America, and can date back thousands of years. However, over its relatively short span of existence, the United States has managed to produce some of its own legendary spirits, and there may be no American boogeyman more famous or more influential than the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Created by author Washington Irving in the pages of his 1820 novel The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, this headless ghost and the doomed Ichabod crane have become a pillar of American folklore. And in the more than 2 centuries since it was published, Irving's story and its iconic ghost have influenced generations of horror, led to countless adaptations, and even changed the history of the town that it was based on. But is there any truth to this slice of Gothic Americana horror? What is Irving's story saying about the influence of legends and folklore in America? And how has this story and its adaptations changed to reflect the times? Come with me on this journey into the legend of Sleepy Hollow, Washington Irving's foundational American ghost story. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Ghost of the Headless Horseman may be a quintessentially American story, but its influences come from around the world and across centuries. Its author, Washington Irving, is the one who brought them all together, and in doing so, became one of the first successful American authors in history. Born in 1783 in Manhattan, Washington Irving was born to Scottish and English parents at the end of the Revolutionary War and named after the first U.S. president. By his early 20s, Irving was writing for newspapers, and while he passed the bar exam, writing was his passion, going on to create a magazine and his first book in 1809, A History of New York from the Beginning of the World to the End of the Dutch Dynasty by Diedrich Knickerbocker, written following the death of his fiancée and eventually responsible for the Knicks nickname given to New Yorkers. This, like other following works, was written under a pseudonym, and you can start to see how Irving's mixture of fake history mixed with a real love for New York, bang bong, would result in Sleepy Hollow. However, when Irving wrote his legend, it was part of the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, once again written under the Knickerbocker name and published as a series of 34 essays and short stories across 1819 and 1820. The series, while a huge success and also including Rip Van Winkle, was written and initially published while Irving lived in England after moving there in a failed attempt to save the family merchant business. Published in both the United States and England, the sketchbook was a massive success, and in it, you can see both Irving's passion and critique of America. These are stories where America is home to the brave and foolish, and composed of both the beautiful and the terrifying. And that leads us to one of the last installments in the collection, published on March 15, 1820, and our subject, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land, and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights, and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. The story begins with a description of the rural community of Tarrytown and the quiet, picturesque valley of Sleepy Hollow in New York, with Irving quickly establishing not only the beauty of the area, but also the many different folktales, superstitions, and ghosts that seemingly have a connection to the place. All of this serves as background and setting to the story of Ichabod Crane, a school teacher from Connecticut who has come to the area to serve as educator to the local children. And Crane, really without any money of his own and dependent on being housed and fed by the parents of his students, soon sets his eyes on young Katrina Van Tassel, both for her being beautiful and also the daughter of a wealthy local farmer. However, Crane's courtship also makes him rivals with Abraham Van Brunt, aka Brom Bones, who's essentially the beloved neighborhood jock. And now you're wondering what this has to do with anything about the Headless Horseman. Well, really, that's the climax of the story, as late one autumn night, Ichabod encounters the Headless Horseman and is chased through the town. And while Crane is able to cross the bridge that local legends say the horseman can't cross, he's struck by the horseman throwing his own head at him. Afterward, Ichabod Crane disappears from the town, never to be heard of again. But was he taken by the horseman, or was he simply scared off by a prank? As a New York native, hey yo, Irv, hit me up with some of them glizzies, you heard? And a longtime resident of the Hudson Valley, Washington Irving had a lifelong love of the area, and because of that, the real-life location of Tarrytown in the Hudson Valley, as well as many different actual people, deeply influenced the story of the Headless Horseman, as well as many other Irving stories like Rip Van Winkle. In fact, Irving's story became so deeply tied to the area in the following centuries that the town of North Tarrytown eventually renamed itself to Sleepy Hollow in 1996. In the century since it was published, historians have speculated on which real-life people were the influences behind the characters in Irving's story, with Irving actually meeting someone named Ichabod Crane during the War of 1812, while many historians have speculated on various real-life friends as well as teachers that may have been the inspiration behind the characters' characteristics. As for the legends spoken about within the story, Irving is pulling from both New York folklore and other myths he'd heard over the years to spin up a brand new ghost that has no actual historical root in the Hudson Valley. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region, and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper, whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk, hurrying along in the gloom of night, as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning the spectre, allege that the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing to his being belated, and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows, and the spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Most credit the story of the horseman with being rooted in the apparently true story of an anonymous Hessian soldier who was decapitated by a cannonball during the Battle of White Plains in the Revolutionary War, not far from Tarrytown. But despite being the quintessential example of this type of ghost, there were many other headless horsemen that rode before him. There's an Irish legend of the Dullahan, an embodiment of death and an all-black rider carrying his own head. Poet Walter Scott adapted the German poem The Wild Huntsman into his own poem of The Chase in 1796, and eventually Scott would become friends with Irving, and that is seen by a lot of people as having a direct influence on this story. These, combined with the Revolutionary War story, are likely the ingredients that created Irving's Headless Horseman. But there are headless horsemen in myths throughout the world, including England and Mexico, that predate Irving's story. And it really shows how this idea and specter has ingrained itself in cultures from around the world. And after only being hinted at for most of the story, the Headless Horseman appears to Crane as he's riding home from a party and a disappointing attempt at courting Katrina. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. it was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of the saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the spectre started full jump with him. Away then they dashed, through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. It's only a few pages long, but the chase has clearly cemented itself in the minds of readers and become the most important part of the legend, almost to the point of making everything that came before it unimportant when people think about it. It all climaxes in Ichabod reaching the bridge that Brom had said saved him. "If I can but reach that bridge," thought Ichabod, "I am safe." Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side. And now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him, Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. By the end of the story, Ichabod has disappeared from Sleepy Hollow without a trace, leaving only his hat and a smashed pumpkin near where he was struck. Some say he was taken by the rider. Some say they saw him in New York. But in either case, the legend only grew bigger and bigger over time. Of course, Irving leaves us with a clue that Crane wasn't actually hit by a decapitated head, but a pumpkin that his fear mistook for a head, and that the rider wasn't actually a ghost, but Brom Bones in disguise, scaring off his romantic rival and marrying Katrina, keeping the secret to himself. And this is what I think is really fascinating about Sleepy Hollow, and something that really gets left out of most adaptations just because it's really hard to adapt in something outside of print. Instead of just being a scary story or a haunting, Irving's Sleepy Hollow is about the power of myths and legends and how they can influence seemingly rational people. Throughout the story, Irving comes back again and again to Ichabod Crane's fascination with ghost stories and his own fears over imagined goblins and monsters. Crane is shown to be constantly reading Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, planting the idea of the supernatural deep in his mind. And despite his fascination, Crane is constantly spooked by any sound or shadow during his long walks home at night, his imagination always getting the best of him. So it's no surprise that Brom Bones, who boasts of having outraced the horseman to a bridge he couldn't cross, uses the legend to scare off his rival. And frankly, Irving likes Brom and kinda dislikes Ichabod Crane. Brom is loud and rowdy, but also harmless and loved by the community. Crane is kind of a parasite on Sleepy Hollow. But to further drive the point home, the legend of Sleepy Hollow ends with a postscript that reveals how everything you've just read has been transcribed from a night when the author was told this story. Yet, rather than insist on the Headless Horseman being a real spirit, the storyteller admits that everything he said might just be a legend when pressed by a very skeptical listener, closing out the story by saying, "Faith, sir," replied the storyteller, "as to that matter, I don't believe one half of it myself." And I think this places the entire story into a really interesting context. Irving has created a new piece of American folklore, not by trying to fool the reader into believing something that he made up, but instead by illustrating the power of legend over even the mind of a seemingly well-educated teacher. Is the Headless Horseman real? Clearly not in real life, but even inside of Irving's story, we're led to doubt the reality of this ghost. While nothing is confirmed one way or another, we're led to believe either one of two conclusions. Either the horseman was real and he killed Ichabod, or it was actually just Brom Bones in disguise, and he scared off Ichabod Crane so that he could have Katrina all to himself. Of course, it's more exciting to believe that the horseman is a real spirit, and most adaptations lean into the purely supernatural. But I think that the idea that this is Brom Bones using legend and superstition against Ichabod, and using the town's own folklore, is something that I think makes the rest of the story a lot more important. Now, this isn't the story of a teacher carried away by an intrusive ghost at the worst moment imaginable, but a town's legends used to scare off an intruder by the community's favorite jock. The uncertainty of it all, and our willingness to let our imaginations run wild, is what has allowed the legend of Sleepy Hollow to grow in our minds and take on so many new forms. Of course, for any story this popular and in the public domain for so long, there have been plenty of adaptations. The first was the 1922 silent film titled The Headless Horseman, followed by a 1934 cartoon short of the same name made by Iwerks, who big old nerds will know as the co-creator of Mickey Mouse and Oswald and the Lucky Rabbit alongside Walt Disney. However, that one's mostly overshadowed by Disney's own take on the material with the 1949 film The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. As I discussed a few years ago in my Disney at War video, this is a package film made during Disney's wartime era that brings two shorter stories together for a feature-length production, with the first half adapting The Wind in the Willows and the second half being The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. However, as this was made after the end of World War II, the production majorly benefited from a bigger budget, and the animation is really great. It's also a pretty accurate adaptation of the Irving story, with the majority of it focused on Ichabod's growing reputation across town, his courtship of Katrina, and the rivalry with Giga Chad and Proto Gaston without the shortcomings, Brom frickin' Bones. It's also narrated by Bing Crosby, who lends his deep voice and singing to a short that, like Irving's writing, lacks dialogue and is instead told completely through narration. But of course, what we're all here for is Ichabod's encounter with the horseman, and I gotta say, this is probably the best the ghost has ever looked on screen. Co-directors Jack Kinney and Clyde Geronimi really bring a lush animation to the spirit, and the chase is still thrilling, spooky, and funny nearly 80 years later. I also think that this, along with some early paintings, solidified the look of the horseman forever, with his dark purple cape breaking up his all-black original description, and a flaming jack-o'-lantern for a head instead of a simple pumpkin, and it's frickin' sick. I gotta say, if I could look like any fictional character, it would be this horseman. Sure, it might be hard to communicate without the old dome, but imagine the aura. In general, Sleepy Hollow adaptations really picked up steam at the end of the 20th century and during the last few decades. You've got a lot of alternate tellings of the story and novels that take up the viewpoints of other characters, musical theater adaptations, radio plays, songs, a roller coaster, and quite a few TV shows. That includes an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? Stealing a classic piece of literature is cheating, kid. You're out of the Midnight Society. A super charming episode of Wishbone, dang, that little pup sure had a big imagination, and 4 seasons of the Fox show Sleepy Hollow, which has Ichabod and the Horseman transported to modern day for spooky detective mysteries. It is, and I mean this in the most derogatory way possible, very much like Supernatural. But maybe the most famous adaptation, and the one that takes the most liberties with the source material, is Tim Burton's 1999 film Sleepy Hollow. Described in the vaguest terms, it seems like Irving's story. Ichabod, horseman, haunted town, but that's about it. Here, Johnny Depp plays Ichabod Crane as a haunted and skittish detective who uses new forms of forensics to solve crimes. Soon, he's called to the town of Sleepy Hollow to investigate a series of beheadings. Okay, plenty of changes already. Which leads him to the very real, very supernatural, very deadly Headless Horseman, played by a pointy-toothed Christopher Walken in flashbacks. Yes, there's elements that pay homage to Irving's ideas, including Ichabod being pranked by a fake horseman and other supernatural forces in the area, as well as the central tree of the story, but this is Burton and writer Andrew Kevin Walker pushing into the darkest, most gothic sensibilities that are even hinted at in the original story. Here, Sleepy Hollow isn't an idyllic American village where the darkest specters are all made up. It's a town full of lies, betrayal, death, and a literal mouth to hell at its center. and I like it. The story is kind of a mess, but the effects and cinematography are great, and it's Burton still at the height of his spooky bullshit powers. But aesthetically, the film is also completely different from the novel. Irving's Sleepy Hollow is this sumptuous golden feast and harvest that anyone would love to visit. Burton's Sleepy Hollow is gray and dark and dying, and it's filled with remorse. Then again, the Horseman of Irving's story is just a myth, a little bit of flavor added to the town. The Horseman of Burton's movie is very real, and like, this whole town is crazy haunted. People are getting their heads lopped off every night. It's very Tim Burton, with Depp bringing weirdo energy, Christina Ricci as the golden girl at the center, and all sorts of strange mechanisms and spells as magic and early forensics collide. It's easily Burton's darkest, bloodiest film, as Crane's investigation surfaces long-buried town secrets that unravel the Horseman's true story and the forces that control him. Brom frickin' Bones is also here, now played by Casper Van Dien, who gives him big high school quarterback energy. He's cool, and he 1v1s the Horseman in a sword fight to save the town. It's awesome. He also gets cut in half. Not awesome. It's fascinating to me that Burton and Walker's take is essentially taking the reputation of Irving's legend and letting it run wild in their imagination. It's almost as if this is the story that old Ichabod told everyone after he ran off. As for the legend in real life, Irving's story has turned its location into a slice of Halloween Americana visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists every spooky season. There's readings of Irving's story, tours of the town and the places featured in the legend, and it seems like every year the legend grows and grows. Through it all, what I think is really poignant about the legend is that, while written during Irving's stay in England and after being away from his home for more than a decade, you can feel the author's immense love for the Hudson Valley and Tarrytown in his descriptions of the land and its community. Irving's details of golden crops and delicious feasts and happy homes mean that those spooky nights are worth their little bit of terror. And that's what makes this an essential part of Americana and horror within it. We enjoy being frightened, and while the original story doesn't take place on Halloween, its autumn setting means it's an integral part of how this holiday has become deeply interlinked with American culture. To me, there's something endlessly fascinating about how the legend of Sleepy Hollow is one part real history, one part established local legend, and one part writer's pure imagination. And because of that, it's been able to work its way deeply into American folklore. Because of that, Irving's story has a clear origin to it. There's nothing truly unexplainable about it, and it's a clear work of fiction that we can see Irving came up with. But because of that, I think it's been able to work its way deeply into American folklore. Even today, the United States is still a new country in search of its own meaning and folklore. So an eerie, gothic specter of past wars in simpler times is perfect for a country that's looking to both emphasize its most idyllic qualities and embrace its dark side. That's the Americana of Sleepy Hollow. It's beautiful forests, dark shadows, incredible feasts, terrifying ghosts, grand romantic gestures, and the specter of death, all at the edge of town, where civilization and nature meet. So it's no wonder why Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman worked their way into American legend, coming along at just the right time and cementing Irving as one of the founding fathers of American folklore. At first, the Headless Horseman could be seen alongside American legends like Paul Bunyan and Johnny Appleseed, early touchstones of the country building its folklore as it spread across the continent. But while those frontier heroes have mostly been forgotten today, the Headless Horseman remains a powerful piece of American folklore, taking its place alongside urban legends like Bloody Mary, cryptids like Bigfoot and the Jersey Devil, and modern boogeymen like Slender Man. Those are all mythic figures that blend reality and legend, and all ideas I'm drawn to and will someday make videos on. But for now, the Headless Horseman has a connection to America's early years, and its blend of both prosperity and tragedy. And as long as our fascination with the darkness on the edge of town remains, so will the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, waiting for us on a lonely night to chase us to an unknown fate. Thanks for watching today's video, and it's the Summerween finale, and I thought that there would be no better way to close out this season than a classic spooky story. I opened Summerween with a video on Salem's Lot by Stephen King, so I figured it would be great to close it with a classic horror story. And when it comes to classic horror stories, it doesn't get much more classic than The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And of course, most people are already familiar with the legend in general, the Headless Horseman, and a lot of the adaptations of it, especially the Disney cartoon and the Tim Burton live-action movie. But I also really wanted to dig into just the story itself, as well as its background and its influence and what Irving was trying to say with it. Over the years, I've seen how it's been changed a lot and how its reputation has grown because of the many different adaptations, but what I found really interesting on diving into it was how it really did depict this as just a legend, but because of that, it's really grown in fame more and more over the centuries, which I think is really cool. Of course, Irving was most famous for making this and Rip Van Winkle, but he is one of those founding American authors who influenced a lot of writers that came right after him. And doing so is really foundational for most American authors, or at least most American horror and fantasy authors, that have some sort of direct tie to the country and are trying to say something about it. So really, even though I don't think he has the biggest reputation today among classic authors, he's easily one of the most influential. And I think that The Legend of Sleepy Hollow holds up really well as this slice of Americana and a little bit of romantic drama, and of course the horror at the end of the story, which sort of has a wink and a nudge to it. And I just really enjoyed diving into it. And overall, I've really enjoyed making my Summerween videos this year, and I hope that you've enjoyed watching them too. This is the end of Summerween, but in just a few months it will be Halloween. So expect another big month there where I cover a lot more spooky stories, movies, and maybe some books. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Sleepy Hollow and its different adaptations, as well as your own favorite adaptation. And as always, a huge thank you to my members and patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive reviews, with this month's exclusive review being on The Changeling. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and that you've had a happy Summerween.